Heracon Publishing presents The Crystal Chronicles, written by Alessia Dickson, narrated by Carly Street, in loving memory of Giovanna Conte. Prologue. Tokyo, 6 years ago. The day Kurt Bell had to kill thousands of innocent people was ironically picturesque. The sun was shining, the people in the city were smiling, and he honestly couldn't remember a time when he had been in a better mood. It was a mood, he knew, that would only brighten as the carefully crafted plans for the day were set into motion. He was rather enthralled by the job, but he just couldn't help being a bit wary of all the blood he knew would be spilt. He didn't want to stain his suit, and besides, he felt so great that the last thing he needed was the depressing look of tragedy that usually accompanied the sight of blood all over his body. Nevertheless, the job needed to be done, and Kurt was just the man to do it. At a mere 24 years old, he was considered a genius in combat, strategic planning, academics, and especially his specific magic type. It came as no surprise that many organizations had attempted to recruit him, but he had disregarded most of them, until he stumbled upon a group worthy his time. The Society, a group with a meaningful goal. To be fair, the Society was the most well-known group of the time, to the supernatural community and to the mortal world, although they knew it by another name, of course. As oblivious to the magic around them as they were to their own inevitable extinction, the mortals blamed the bloodshed and destruction on simple terrorist groups. The Society was so much more than that. His kind, elementals, people skilled in practicing magic involving any one of the 4 natural elements, ran the organization, and it was only fitting that he had taken his place among the elite. It didn't take long for Kurt to gain attention within the group, and soon he was climbing the status ladder and approaching the top at an alarming rate. Kurt smiled, enjoying the cool blast of the conditioned air as he contemplated the task he couldn't afford to mess up. As a rising force in the Society, he was not yet the one who planned these things. He was the one who planned for what was not planned. A job like this was hard to tackle, and countless things could go wrong. He quickly threw open the door to the car, in which he had been bottled up for hours, and briskly stepped out onto the edge of a busy road. He hastily fixed his tie, smoothing out any wrinkles that had woven itself into the fabric. His usual pale face now met the harsh, unforgiving rays of the sun, and as the light faded to a tolerable shade, he adjusted his sharp eyes. For a moment, he stood observing people as they bustled around, caught up in their daily lives, analyzing, always analyzing. He couldn't deny the repulsive, ill-fated feeling bubbling up in his chest. He scowled. Mortals. They were such useless, weak beings for such an abundant race. They were ruining the pleasant day, and Kurt thought it was almost better that way, as it made it easier to remember what was worth fighting for. He always thought he was rather fortunate to be born a Draken, a type of elemental who specialized in harnessing the magic of the fire element. Since the dawn of time, his people had lived with the earth rather than on it, and since his birth he had watched as mortals multiplied in number, slowly but surely sucking the very life from the planet. He wanted to eliminate them all, one by one, to watch the life fade out of their silly blank expressions, to watch as their ordinary blood tainted the soil. He wanted to release the fire coursing through his veins. Luckily, he wasn't the only one who strove to see the downfall of the mortal race. It had always been the Society's goal to eliminate mortals, leaving only a small population of supernatural beings. The Society would rise to power, and Kurt would be the one leading the world into a new era. They grew closer to their goal with each passing day, although what his subordinates called the genocide of billions was no easy feat. Kurt didn't like to think of his goal as genocide. It was merely the healing of the earth and restoring balance. Kurt suppressed a rather exasperated sigh, the sun curling the tips of his slicked blonde hair almost white. His eyes were as dark as Ank's, yet as sharp as the blade he kept hidden under his trench coat. Today he had to execute yet another massacre. He supposed he had to take small steps in order to achieve his goal. He just wished his jobs weren't always so tedious. Kurt had attended so many of these things that he lost track, and the dull, piercing screams of countless humans and elementals alike lay dormant in the back of his mind, long ago making peace with his nightmares. Kurt quickly extended his gaze, assessing more specifically this time, spotting his subordinates in the crowd, flawlessly blending in just as he had instructed them to do. Every minute detail of the job had been planned. In exactly 3 minutes and 32 seconds, the clock would strike midday. His co-workers, carefully woven within the crowd, each concealing an impressive collection of lethal weapons, would begin eliminating the mortals who were unlucky enough to be in the close vicinity. There would be chaos, lots of chaos, as people would return to the earth. The ones still alive would surely be screaming. The mortal authorities, like the police, would be called, and he supposed it would get quite messy. But as many would be eliminated as possible, and even that was only scratching the surface of the job. 112 feet away, a council meeting was currently being held. Kurt automatically cringed at the thought of the council, the governing body of the supernatural world. Most were elementals, and extremely powerful ones at that, and would not stand for the new world Kurt hoped to create. If kept alive, they would be a pressing problem, and perhaps even a threat. Thus, Kurt had readily decided that they would all have to be eliminated. No survivors. He was certain that they would not go easily, but Kurt had faith in his workers. They would do their part, targeting the mortals down below, as he cornered the council members up above. The plan would be executed perfectly, just like everything else Kurt had ever done. Less than 1 minute and 20 seconds to go. Kurt licked his parched lips. What a pity that such a nice day would be ruined by the likes of this disaster. A single gunshot was fired into the crowd, and suddenly a blood-curdling scream reached his ears, followed immediately by more panicked shouts. The chaos began, like a match being set to tinder, and people were running, shouting, and shoving each other out of the way in the hopeless attempt to scramble to safety. He watched for 34 seconds as a total of 5 bodies fell to the ground in rapid succession, before finally turning away and focusing on his original intent. His employees were working effectively, each claiming another life before disappearing like mist into the breeze and then reappearing somewhere else to take a few more. Kurt followed suit, lunging forward and running along the path towards the council meeting, a path he had carefully scoped out weeks ago. There were no flaws in a plan if Kurt Bell had created it. His knife grazed his skin as he moved, the edges of the hilt digging into the flesh along his upper leg. There was no time to pause and readjust the weapon. It was an executioner's duty to be as silent as the very shadows. That meant no stopping or second-guessing under any circumstances. It took less than a minute to weave through the back alleyways and streets leading up to the building. The sirens and screams could be heard in the distance, the cry of pain too loud to possibly be contained. He bounded up the stairs to the back entrance of the building, the bricks freshly laid and the smell of paint wafting through the air. The building was new, intended specifically for this important council gathering. It would be a gravesite in the next 5 minutes. He could hear screaming from inside, and he almost smiled, but instead maintained his professional demeanor, even though there was no one in sight to tell him otherwise. An ear-splitting emergency siren wailed from the top of the 10-story building, a cry for help that would remain unrequited. His workers had done exactly as he instructed. They had busted open the front door and stormed in, targeting the inferiors on the council. He would take the most important members, the powerful ones. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing their expressions as they realized he had the upper hand. With that endearing thought in mind, he backed up a bit, teetering on his feet, and kicked down the door. The task would have been impossible for just about anyone else, but for him, it wasn't difficult. To be part of the society meant you had to undergo massive physical and mental training, and his muscles barely uttered protest as they pushed against the door. It fell off its hinges with a pathetic squeak and crashed to the ground, creating a booming noise that announced his arrival. He stepped inside, stopping at the front of a winding white staircase that smelled too much like rubber and what he knew to be the metallic scent of blood. He dashed up the stairs, skipping 2 at a time, and then 3, pushed by the forces of his own excitement. He halted when he got to the 6th floor, the level where the meeting was being held. He composed himself before taking in a short breath of air. He was a classy man, and he liked looking his best no matter the occasion, even an occasion like this. He sauntered down the hallway and quite calmly slipped inside the room on his right, leaving the door slightly ajar. There were exactly 20 people in the room, or rather, there had been. About half of them lay dead or dying at his feet. He looked around and briefly absorbed the sight of a few of his subordinates, doing their jobs almost as well as he could have done them. Some of the council members left alive, the ones who were harder to kill, stood shaking and in shock, while others seemed completely emotionless as he had stepped into their line of sight. It was futile to fight back, and everyone in the room knew it. The society had them utterly surrounded and backed into a corner. "No need to look so horribly frightened," Kurt finally said, in a tone that almost could have passed as sympathetic. "I'll do you all a favor and end this as quickly as possible." Kurt surveyed the rest of the room. A man and a woman very highly regarded on the council, judging by the clothes they wore, stood in the back, glaring at Kurt with more contempt than he thought they should possess. His lips curled downward into a frown. What nerve these foolish elementals possessed, actually patronizing the one with the upper hand. The woman moved to adopt an attack stance, and Kurt reacted swiftly, raising his hands, which were truly the best trigger for magic. Before the couple could attack, Kurt shot 4 long tendrils of flame, ricocheting between his fingers before flying through the air, coiling around the couple's wrists and immediately paralyzing their movements. A fire lock. This was Kurt's usual mode of attack, locking and paralyzing victims in a personal set of fiery chains. If the caster was powerful, the attack could successfully nullify any other forms of magic, cutting off the victim's circulation for magic to flow. Fortunately, Kurt was as strong as they came. He moved towards the immobilized couple, more curious than violent at first. He always thought it was nice to speak with his victims, to get a real sense of their character. Memories, after all, were the only thing that remained of a person, and Kurt liked to file them all. The man and the woman, he assumed they were a couple by how closely together they stood, didn't even flinch as he advanced towards them. "I am truly sorry that the 2 of you had to be caught up in this mess," he said rather flatly, concentrating on keeping the flames locked around their wrists. The man hissed in pain. Fire did indeed burn flesh, and even elementals were not spared from that. Shockingly, despite her steaming flesh, the woman regarded Kurt with a sneer. Not too bad, Kurt thought. She really was a very pretty thing with dark blue eyes as violent as a storm that pulled him into her defiance as their gazes met. Long black hair framed her angular face and spilled down her back. Such an alluring elemental. She was too beautiful to die, yet too important to be spared. Her husband, who was writhing in pain beside her, had dark green eyes that held an impressive level of contempt. "My name is Kurt Bell, and I work for the society," he said softly to the woman, resisting the urge to reach out and push back the lock of wild black hair that cascaded like a waterfall over her forehead. The couple triggered a faint memory in his archive of faces and names. Travy. The name rested heavily on his tongue as he realized who they were. "You are the famous Travies," he continued, not managing to keep the surprise from his voice. His expression ran sour, curdled by the Travy family's status. They came from extremely powerful bloodlines, one that had to be eliminated for the good of the cause. The woman remained expressionless as the famous name rushed past his lips, but something in her posture shifted ever so slightly, giving him all the confirmation he needed. "The Society's goal is to create an ideal world. Mortals and council members shall not be present in that world. Escape is futile. You and your comrades will be put to rest here." He gestured to the huge window, through which could be seen the swirl of chaos below them in the blood-splattered streets. The woman released a dry laugh as she realized the horrid truth to his words, but her eyes suddenly looked sad and defeated. "Run!" The woman's voice echoed throughout the room, authoritative and demanding. Her comrades, still alive and mobile, reacted to her order, fleeing the room past the other Society members. Kurt made a swinging motion with 2 fingers, signaling his workers to go after the slew of members who had fled. They moved with silent, merciless obedience. Kurt smiled, the room now completely empty, but for himself and the famous couple. "Nothing good ever comes out of being a martyr," he said softly, taking a moment to appreciate the couple's fearlessness and their quick reaction to the crisis. "Foolish man," the woman spat coldly. "A stronger, smarter generation is coming. They will walk the earth as the ashes of your organization rain from the skies. I know it is so. My children have been brought into this world, and as you rip my time away from me, I rest in peace with the knowledge that I have taught them justice and have showed them what's worth fighting for. They will crush you and all that you stand for." Kurt repressed a sigh. It wasn't uncommon for victims to get cocky and self-righteous before their demise. The man, on the other hand, remained silent. He held a steely glare, but the mention of his children had a calming effect, and an almost happy expression passed over his face. Kurt decided to grant them their peace in that moment. He whipped a gun out of his pocket, pressed his finger against the roughness of the trigger, and fired once at the man. It was a clear shot to the chest. To be quick, and Kurt had never missed once. The man's limp body hung in the air for a moment, at the mercy of Kurt's firelock, before he was released and his corpse fell soundlessly, the peaceful look still apparent on his face. The woman produced a desperate gasp, tears streaming down the curves of her cheeks as Kurt turned towards her. "Don't worry," he said greedily, taking in as much of her beauty as he could. "I'll make this quick." Taking careful aim, he fired the gun squarely at her center and felt wisps of pity crawl through his veins as he watched her now lifeless form crumple to the ground beside her husband. He looked at the fallen couple once more before turning around to take inventory of the situation. No survivors. The plan was a success, just as he'd anticipated it would be. He stood for a few moments, committing the whole incident to memory before his workers soundlessly slipped back into the room, their job clearly finished. He gave a curt nod to his workers, who stood quietly, awaiting his next command. "The project was a success," he said, concealing any remnants of emotion. "Please report promptly back to your stations." "Over 2,000 mortals dead. Over 30 elementals dead. The plan was successful," Kurt announced 1 hour and 13 minutes later as he and the rest of the parties involved began to arrive at their designated meeting place. Finally, they were all seated at an oversized table in a room that was proportionately even larger, mulling over the events of the day. Kurt sat at the head of the table, seeming deep in thought, his expression riddled with tension. Truth be told, Kurt's plan was conducted flawlessly. Plenty of mortals had been eliminated and several council members executed. After all, the annihilation of a few thousand mortals was hardly more than a drop in the bucket when compared to the overall population. Billions of people walked the earth, and it was mathematically impossible that Kurt and the society would have sufficient time to obliterate everyone. No, they needed something bigger, something powerful beyond measure, but the only possibility that lay lurking at the back of his mind was absurd. He hardly thought anyone would disagree with the impossibility of the task, but he predicted none would agree that it was a plausible avenue to explore. He, in his right mind, knew that route simply wasn't supposed to be possible, but a difficult route presented a challenge, and Kurt liked challenges. However, we will need to schedule as many massacres as possible. A few thousand mortals dead is nothing, he continued, suddenly exhausted, the weight of the afternoon wreaking more havoc on him than he cared to admit. The rest of the members in the room remained silent, but many couldn't help but wonder why more scheduled murders would need to be arranged if the project had been a success. My dear colleagues, I am afraid our attempts of cleansing the earth is futile, Kurt sighed, raking a hand through his short-cropped blonde hair, making him look far older than 24. We need something bigger, something better, if we truly ever hope to accomplish this goal. He spoke quietly, yet firmly. There is no other way, argued a desperate voice from the back. An excited chatter skidded through the room. Silence! Kurt thundered after moments of listening to their aimless babble. There is another way. Quite possibly the only way. The temperature in the room almost seemed to drop, as if waiting for Kurt to announce the severity of the solution. Our only chance is the orb. But as I am sure you all know it has been divided into 4 separate crystals and scattered across the globe. He shook his head, frustrated. The 4 crystals aren't even accessible without an auction. Damn it! His voice escalated, thick with frustration, and he fought to contain his temper. Temper was a flaw, and Kurt couldn't afford flaws. He pressed the pads of his fingers to his temple, clearing his mind before facing his subordinates once more. The formula is simple. Without an auction, there will be no orb. An auction hasn't been born in centuries. The one thing we need is the one thing we can't have. But we can keep looking. We can always keep looking for one. He shrugged, flexing his muscles as they contracted against the weariness of his bones. A pity they're extinct. It would have made our job so much easier. A few dared to agree with him, murmuring words of praise. No matter, he said. We cannot sit here and wait for an auction, though we will look everywhere. We must find other means. I have faith that we can accomplish this. We are the society. Kurt was part of the society, and the society always got what they wanted. The means of getting there was irrelevant as long as the end results were the same. Our means of obtaining our goal is, at the moment, inconclusive. More information will need to be gathered before making any final decisions. I have decided that, for the time being, we will all stick to carrying out the executions. It was clear that Kurt was almost done talking as he pressed his thin lips together. We'll meet soon, I'm sure. He rose from his seat, gazing down at the floor across the room. I have a job to get back to, after all. With that, the man was gone, strolling out the door as if the very ground he walked upon belonged to him. The people left inside sat gaping, and those who happened to glance out the window would have seen a black trench coat flapping in the wind before disappearing inside a silver car. None of those at the gathering really knew where the man disappeared to, yet they were aware of the pool of rumors floating around. Most took no heed of the rumors, passing them off as ridiculous. Surely such an important society representative wouldn't be caught dead doing such a ridiculous job. Nevertheless, there obviously was some motive behind it, some purpose, just like there was behind everything Kurt Bell did. As he liked to say, every detail is important in order to achieve the ultimate end result. And if all went well, a brand new world, the end result to Kurt's madness would be more than worth it. Chapter 1. Light It Up. "Can you quit it already?" I hissed to possibly the most annoying person in the world, Tori Mender. "No," she shot back, with an air of defiance that almost matched mine, and continued to flick me with her sharp, red ballpoint pen. The tip of the pen grazed my forearms, a nuisance more than anything, but one that I had endured for over an hour. "Quit it!" I whispered through gritted teeth, losing what was left of my thinning patience. My math teacher, Miss Meeks, looked up from her book and glared. I clamped my mouth shut and she returned to her reading. This was ridiculous. "I said stop it!" I growled, with an amount of malice in my voice that surprised me. It finally dawned on me to move away, so I picked up my battered chair and dragged it forward. I plopped it next to another desk and refocused my muddled brain on what was now a pathetically blank test sheet. Any possible knowledge I had of mathematics was unreachable now. I couldn't even count the number of times I had been interrupted. I really had no intention of failing math, and I certainly didn't want to endure my parents' wrath about failing a subject. But that seemed completely plausible since I could barely concentrate. I concentrated for all of 10 seconds before Tori's weapon of choice got sharper. The tip of her ballpoint was quite sharp, and she dug it deep enough into the crevices of my arm to cause me discomfort. I glanced up, meeting Tori's dark brown eyes, which were riddled with anger and a hint of conceit. Her sandy blonde hair framed her normal-looking face. She looked completely average, and yet, I knew better. She was evil, housed in some plain-looking blonde form. She gave blondes an even worse name than we already had, which I couldn't help but take a little personally. Despite how much she seemed to loathe my very existence, I couldn't help but try to make sense of it. Tori's motivations were clear. She craved dominance and wanted to manipulate with her constant pestering. I figured she also adored attention, and I briefly wondered what it was in her life that deprived her of it. But in the end, I could feel no empathy, as her current goal in life seemed to be taunting and badgering me until I snapped. The flicking continued until the flesh on my arm began to redden. I would lose this game if I gave her any sort of reaction, so I remained unaffected, pursing my lips shut. Never mind this stupid test. Graduating high school would be impossible to finish if things carried on like this. As to why Tori Mender seemed to hate my guts, I really had no idea. I had no memory of doing anything to scorn her. Quite possibly, she was just a terrible human being, which seemed to be the only possible answer. I fastened my unnerving green eyes onto her cold brown ones again, and somehow, still she had the audacity to continue flicking me. Until she had developed the wonderful new habit of tormenting me like this in class, gloating in my misery and sucking it up like some addictive drug, I had remained unmoved by her taunting. For quite a while now I had endured an impressive array of insults and more than a couple of physical attacks. I knew that not fighting back would do more than just hurt my pride. It would make me lose the battle against Tori. My anger and frustration had been building up since the moment I walked into class, and suddenly the solution was more than clear. Quickly, I lunged out of my seat and struck like some wild animal pouncing on prey. I snatched the red pen out of her hand before she even had a chance to blink. Tori glanced down at her empty hand, a smile quivering at the edges of her mouth. I knew she liked it when I reacted. She made a quick lunge to grab the pen out of my hands, but I was faster and dashed towards my seat a couple of feet away. With little effort, I tightened my hold and snapped the stupid pen in two, producing a loud cracking noise that reverberated throughout the classroom. The noise earned me a few noticeable stares, but I was beyond caring. I dropped the remains of the pen on the floor, and they fell with a clatter. I gave a smug smile. Then she looked down, chuckling softly. What? I practically seethed. "Look down," she said. I gritted my teeth, glancing down to where she was so intently focused. My hands were completely covered in red ink from the pen. I could practically hear her congratulating herself on my display of stupidity, and suddenly, without thinking, I snatched her math test off her desk and smeared my red-inked palm all over the paper. I furiously rubbed my hand across the entire sheet, and then, to top it off, I very politely, if I do say so myself, placed the test delicately back on her desk. "Hand that in," I said gleefully, as her eyes narrowed into angry slits. Unfortunately, I saw Tori around school more than I liked, and the teachers had this ludicrous idea that if we sat beside each other, we would magically become friends. Sitting beside Tori was becoming such a hellish nightmare. "Miss Meeks!" Tori stood up, slamming one hand on her desk and interrupting the silence. "Alyssa ruined my test!" She held up her red sheet as proof. I quickly folded my hands on my lap, away from Miss Meek's prying eyes, but it was too late. It was impossible to deny the claim, so instead I just sat in my seat, jaw clenched, and with glaring hatred in my eyes, I retorted back to Tori. "It's not like you would have passed anyway." "Alyssa!" Miss Meeks snapped icily, looking up from her book. "Does it even bother you in the slightest that one more complaint against you will get you suspended again?" I almost winced at the memory of my first suspension, which was the result of another one of Tori's games, one that I had lost quite disastrously. Did I really care if I was suspended again? Not exactly. It was like a forced vacation, but I didn't want another red flag appearing on my transcripts. "Yes, thank you for asking. It does bother me that I might get suspended again," I said quite calmly. If I was good at anything, it was concealing my emotions. I was exceptionally good at that, yet containing them was a whole other problem altogether. Miss Meeks cocked an eyebrow and pressed her fingertips to her temple. "Well, you're treading on a thin line, Miss Brooks, so sit down now." It took every ounce of my self-control not to explode with the burning rage I was attempting to suppress. "Enough is enough," Miss Meeks said. "Do you understand me?" "Understood." My voice was utterly still and flat, but I could hear the tone of contempt thinly veiled below the surface. I was so close to exploding, and boy, did I want to let that happen, but the idea of getting suspended again wasn't very appealing. There was no point in arguing. Tori had every adult wrapped around her little finger. Miss Meeks wordlessly held out a new test to Tori, who got up to grab it and then bounced back to her desk. I ducked my reddening face towards my test sheet, trying to tune out the conversations circling the room. It took a minute to realize that my hands were twitching, so I began taking deep breaths and held myself back from punching her square in the face. Doing so wouldn't exactly prove that I had a handle on my anger problems, as the teacher called it, which I really didn't have, by the way, but thanks to Tori, everyone saw me as an angry, psychotic freak. It wasn't really shocking as to why I spent almost my entire time in isolation, or maybe I was just unaware of my social disabilities. Either way, my life had been lacking any kind of friendship. For as long as I could remember, I was always alone. I remember my mother trying to console me in earlier years with the excuse that I was just different. Maybe I didn't want to be different. Sure, isolation stung, but over time I grew mentally and physically stronger, and I was used to functioning on my own. I wore my independence like a second skin. Did I want acceptance? Yes. But undeniably, I wanted revenge so much more. With a weary sigh, I ran my fingers through the silky strands of my hair and eyed my test one last time before giving up entirely. I made a grab for my water bottle and uncapped the lid, taking a drink while still managing to maintain my glare. No worthy plots of revenge came to mind, so I just continued to stare at my classmates, hoping that my bright green eyes were as unnerving as everyone claimed them to be. I could hear Tori shifting ever so slightly in her chair. Then sharp kicks started digging painfully into the back of my knee. The top of her boot was surprisingly sturdy and managed to hurt when she struck my leg. Of course, Miss Meeks was engrossed in her book once again. My peers were busy frantically scribbling. No one noticed anything. They wouldn't even notice if my hair was on fire. "Tori!" I growled.
Remind me again why I deserve to sit in front of the worst human being on the face of the planet.
I ask myself why I get to sit beside you, too. She leaned forward on her chair until we were mere inches from each other. But I guess I'm just lucky. Before I had time to utter another snappish remark, she took a single finger and pushed over my open water bottle. Water came pouring out, soaking my whole desk, including my now sodden test, and then sloshed over the edges and doused my clothes. I blinked in disbelief while water dripped onto the floor, splattering in fat droplets. "I'm gonna kill you," I breathed. Her eyes didn't move from my face, which by now was completely red with rage. She leaned towards me and spoke softly into my right ear. "You're disappointing, Alyssa." "I'm sorry, is my misery not enough for you today?" "I thought you were smarter than this, but you're just worthless, and I can see in your eyes that you know it, too." "Shut up!" I roared, unable to keep my flaring anger in check any longer. I rose out of my chair, knocking it over with a loud clatter and trying to think of a fitting insult. I leaned over her chair as she blinked up at me, the smug look in her eyes veiled by long lashes. The class went dead silent. 24 pairs of eyes staring. At that point, I couldn't have been further from caring. "Alyssa!" Miss Meeks shouted, her eyes wide with the same wariness everyone else had when looking at me. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Turn around and face me." I turned, averting my eyes from her stare. Miss Meeks blinked. "Why are you all wet?" "Why don't you ask her?" I said, pointing to Tori. I knew I sounded pretty crazy, but everyone thought so poorly of me anyway. How could it get any worse? At the very least, I thought this must be a hell of a show. "It was an accident," Tori pleaded. "The lid wasn't on." I produced a growl so threatening it made even the toughest delinquent student scoot away. "She was kicking me! I wasn't!" "Give it up!" I scoffed. "I'm being framed by an egotistical lunatic." "Miss Meeks," Tori cried. "She clearly has anger problems." "What?" I shouted, waving my arms in disbelief. "I don't have anger problems!" There was a moment of silence that prompted me to take stock of the situation. Horrified, I realized how believable I sounded and dropped my hands loosely to my sides. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I don't have anger problems," I repeated with a calmness I didn't feel that didn't fool anyone. "I've heard enough," Miss Meeks finally snapped. "Apologize right now, Alyssa." There was no way I was going to say sorry to that thing. I balled up my fists again, my nails digging into the skin of my palms. I was so profoundly angry I could barely take in any air. "I believe," I said, dead serious, "that I'd rather be shot in the head." Miss Meeks' eyes widened. "I said apologize right now." I bit my tongue and the room fell into a heavy silence that practically dripped with tension. Miss Meeks waited patiently for my apology, drumming her fingernails against the hard exterior of a textbook. Well, no matter how long she waited, she wasn't going to get what she wanted. I looked at the clock, wondering how long I was going to stand there. 2 minutes? 3? The ticking of the clock did little to reduce the fervor of my rage. I was sick of it all. Then it suddenly occurred to me that my insides felt like they were on fire. I fixed my glance on the recessed light in the ceiling above Tori's head, trying to distract myself. I felt so horrifically bad. Maybe I did have anger problems. Regardless, none of this ever would have happened if it wasn't for Tori. I took a big gulp of air and unclenched my fists, finding a reprieve in the heat of my rage. Suddenly, I was aware of an incredible adrenaline rush from within me, sort of like pressure that builds up in a shaken soda. The world suddenly went red. "Alyssa?" Miss Meeks inquired faintly. "Are you?" Her words were cut short by a deafening popping noise that radiated throughout the room. The noise vibrated the floor and rattled the desks like a localized earthquake. I whipped around just in time to see the light bulb above Tori's head shatter into 1,000 pieces.
Startled, I jumped out of the way and screamed so loud it could have shattered another bulb. The explosion had been instantaneous and violent, as though the molecules in the glass could no longer stand being near each other. Glass flew everywhere like raindrops, but most of it, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you looked at it, fell directly onto Tori's head. She let out a surprised scream, her hands automatically flying to her head. The glass had already tumbled down, spreading out and decorating her in little sparkling pieces. I stood gaping, my jaw hanging halfway to the floor. What just happened? All the baffled looks on the students' faces confirmed that I wasn't imagining things in my head. This actually happened. All the anger that I was feeling moments before disappeared, and the fire that was burning through my veins finally extinguished. I felt better than I had in a long time, but most notably, I felt different. It felt like I had been standing behind a blurred lens my whole life, and it was only now that everything was coming into focus. I saw the individual tiny pieces of glass on Tori's hair and shoulders. The whispers circulating the room were no longer whispers. They were now loud voices that shrieked in my ears and pounded against my skull. Suddenly, just being in this room was too much. "Tori," Miss Meeks exclaimed, her eyes wide. "Are you all right?" A shadow of mortification spread over Tori's face. "No, obviously I'm not. A freaking light bulb just exploded over my head." Miss Meeks reached down to help Tori out of her chair. Remnants of plaster and glass still tumbled down from above. I glanced upwards into the now giant hole in the ceiling where the light used to be. "What was that?" I finally asked, my eyes wide with disbelief. Any remembrance of my expected apology was forgotten, and Miss Meeks shrugged. "I haven't the slightest idea. Maybe some weird chemical reaction?" Her voice trailed off, and the entire room seemed to shift with unease. "Alyssa, go call the janitor to clean up this mess," she said, waving me away. I still wore a shocked look on my face as I slipped through the classroom door, taking my well-deserved leave. I made my stop at the janitor's office and rapped my knuckles loudly against the wooden door. "Hello?" I called hesitantly. "Is anyone there?"
"I'll be right there,"
answered a gruff but somehow kind voice. I waited patiently, and the familiar face of our school janitor appeared. He was a burly man, probably in his late 50s, with a mop of curly brown hair coupled with twinkling brown eyes. "Hi," I said, tightly. "There was an accident in our classroom."
"Yeah? What kind of accident?"
I said sheepishly. "A light bulb exploded." He looked at me incredulously before giving a genuine hearty laugh.
"Kid," he said, smiling, "go back to class."
"No, I swear a light bulb really did explode right over a student's head."
"You're sure?"
Completely sure."
"You better be,"
he said, giving in and grabbing a bucket of cleaning supplies. I led the way down an array of winding hallways and back into the classroom. He followed me inside, tentatively, and scratched his head as he surveyed the room.
"Hey, kid,"
he remarked as he glanced up at the gaping hole in the ceiling.
"How did this even happen?"
"Trust me," I said slowly. "I have absolutely no idea." My mother exclaimed later that night, a deep frown etched in the planes of her face. "Explain this to me again?" I was currently in the process of explaining to my mother why I seemed to be in such a great mood. I was rarely this happy, and the mere mention of the incident had me grinning. Her face was blank as I quickly retold the story, and when I was finished, I caught a flicker of another emotion behind her eyes. It looked like panic. "So what?" I asked, more amused than anything, glancing at her fidgety body movements. "You don't believe me?" Well, how could she? How could anyone if they hadn't witnessed it firsthand? "You're this happy because a light bulb exploded?" she inquired, ignoring my question.
Yes, I nodded. Right over this girl's head. And I was angry with her, too. You should have seen the look on her face. Serves her right. At that, my mother's eyes went impossibly wide, her mouth dropping open in shock. The look was almost startling, and I was about to ask about it when I was interrupted by my father, who chose that moment to breeze through the kitchen. "Eric," my mom said in a clipped tone, shooting my dad a look that was completely foreign to me. He didn't even bother acknowledging my presence. He seemed to instantly understand the nature of my mom's look and nodded quickly. There was a moment of awkward silence as they both looked at me. I mumbled, a bit unnerved by the horrified looks. What's wrong?" "Alyssa, do you mind stepping outside for a few minutes while your father and I speak privately?" "Actually, I do mind, but thanks for asking." "Alyssa, please," my dad said. "Your mother and I need to have a talk." You can talk with me here," I challenged, crossing my arms defiantly. My dad did not look amused with my suggestion and motioned me toward the doorway with a wave of his hand. When I didn't move, he glared. "It'll just be for a few minutes." I didn't budge, and he sighed, moving himself out into the hallway with my mother trailing behind. I frowned, peering after them with my curiosity most definitely piqued. I was almost tempted to follow them, but with the open design of the house, there was nowhere to hide, and eavesdropping was definitely not an option. "No, Eric, it's time," my mother suddenly hissed. I whipped around, half expecting them to be whispering right behind me, yet they were still conversing in the hallway. I frowned. I heard my dad shush her, and then it got quiet again. Despite having extremely sharp hearing, their hushed voices were so low now that they were practically inaudible. Only if I really concentrated could I make out some of their faintly whispered words. "Sienna," my dad said, "if she knows who she is, she..." I didn't catch the last part of his sentence as it faded out, and I grinded my teeth together in frustration. "We know what we've had to do. Ever since that day," my mom replied earnestly. "We did what was necessary. Had to keep her safe. Can't feel guilty." "What will happen?" my dad questioned. "She'll... no choice but to go to Magnorium," my mom answered, sounding impatient. "We knew it was coming. Held off as long as possible. You know that." I slid deeper into the cushion of my chair, biting my lip. Who were they talking about? Me? What was Magnorium? Was I just flat out losing my mind? "She won't know anything. Too far behind." The conversation resumed, and I recognized the tone of my dad's voice. It was something I'd had aimed at me dozens of times. Absolute pity. Parts of the conversation were fading out, and I tried desperately to piece it together and understand. "You'll have to... and deal with her. Done explaining." "I know," my mom said in a tone of defeat. "And you know what could happen. Directly, for the first time. It could... You'll have to..." My father's words sounded frantic. I couldn't hear anything else for a long moment, and then my mom's voice rang out sharply. "Fine! Alyssa!" Her voice was suddenly very loud, and I jolted as my tender ears adjusted. When they both came strolling back into the kitchen, they seemed off somehow, distracted and almost wary. This wasn't at all how my parents acted, and that could only mean that something was seriously wrong. I ran through a series of worst possible scenarios, but none seemed plausible. Their odd conversation seemed cryptic, almost like a puzzle to sort out, except I had no pieces. "We have something to tell you," my mom said rather nervously. "Are you busy?" "Well, since this seems rather urgent, I guess not." She awarded me with a tight smile and quickly sat in the chair beside me. I suddenly felt ridiculously out of place, which was terribly wrong since this was my own home. "What we are about to tell you is absolutely the truth, and we would appreciate it if you could try to understand the best you can. You might be a bit confused at first, but that's okay." I I could think of nothing else to do except nod. All right. The silence that followed seemed to last too long for comfort, so I urged them hastily on as I wanted plenty of time for explanation. Can we get on with this, please? I braced myself to hear that I had 4 months to live, or that I had inherited a mental illness, something terrible like that. Alyssa, are you familiar with the 4 natural elements that are a key part of our world? What? I blinked, taken aback. Is this a rhetorical question? No, my mom replied slowly, her voice full of patience. Do you know of these 4 natural elements? They are mentioned mostly in legends and myths you may have read about. I don't know what you're talking about, I exploded, and I'm not here for a lesson on mythology. What was the point of all this? Just please explain what you're talking about. Well, she continued calmly, ignoring my outburst, the 4 natural elements are earth, air, fire, and water. These elements are said to be the most important aspects of our existence and life as we know it. Interesting, I muttered, cocking an eyebrow. What does this have to do with anything? Other than our very existence? Nothing at all, my mom shot back. I pursed my lips together and let her continue. Just like the 4 natural elements, there are 4 special groups living on Earth that are directly linked with these elements. Each individual group embodies one of these elements. The more she talked, the more her voice evened out, growing slowly steadier. These people have powers based on the root of their element, she continued. For example, if you belong to the water group, your powers will be strictly water-based. I was quiet for a moment, drawing my hands into my lap. I felt an unrestrained smile curling at the edges of my mouth, and I laughed dryly. Had my parents gone mad overnight, or was I just the crazy one? Are you saying that magic exists? I asked, with an underlying air of humor dripping from my tone. My parents both remained undeterred by my patronizing demeanor. They looked so serious that the smile faded from my face. You might not believe it, she whispered firmly, but yes, magic does exist. That's funny. You two are doing great. After a few more moments of silence with no one proclaiming the punchline to this joke, I grew annoyed. Knock it off! I don't have time for this, and it's rather frightening to think that the 2 of you do. My mother shot me an imploring look, and I gulped. This is our history, Alyssa. Yes, you established that already. Is this a secret history lesson that school forgot to teach? Alyssa, what exactly are you saying? I interrupted. That magic and supernaturals actually exist? Yes, my dad said with a nod of his head. These special groups of people are known as elementals. The level of seriousness on their faces had me re-examining the situation. They truly did not appear to be joking. The parents I knew weren't like this. Were they simply delusional, or did I really not know my parents at all? What was going on? Prove it! I snapped, deciding to take the conversation as seriously as they seemed to be. We can't prove it to you, sweetie, my mom said quietly. What? It's been this way ever since you were born. We were going to tell you years ago, but we decided to wait until you were a little older. So now, I guess, you are old enough. Well, actually, if you don't tell me what you're talking about in the next 10 seconds, I'm out of here, I half shouted. And I may not come back, so you better be quick. My dad shook his head fiercely, laying a hand on my arm. I bristled under his touch. Somehow it never felt more foreign. You don't understand. That's perfectly fine with me, because I don't think I want to. Alyssa, your mother and I are both elementals, and that means you're one too. Chapter 2. The Truth is in the Fire. After that surprising proclamation, I figured it would be safe to take my leave. I hastily jumped out of my seat and tried to make a break for the doorway. My father was lightning fast and clamped a hand around my wrist, hauling me backwards into my seat. I blinked, petrified of his iron grip. What are you doing? Just listen to what we have to say, my mother begged. It seemed like I wouldn't be leaving this room of my own free will. It's not like I'm going anywhere, apparently, so go ahead, speak. So, Alyssa, it's important to understand that while there are 4 natural elements, there exists 5 distinct groups of magic. So what are these 5 groups? I asked sarcastically. 4 of the 5 groups have a name that corresponds with the element they represent. The first group embodies the magic of earth. They are known as terrans, meaning land in Latin. Remember when you were 5 and that bird crashed into the window? You were so upset because you thought it died, but if you remember correctly, it was fine the next day? Terrans have the ability to heal properties of the natural world, such as animals. I'm Terran, she exclaimed with a proud grin. I could only reciprocate with a scowl. The memory of the bird was foggy, but existed in my mind nonetheless. The second group, Skyros, represent air magic. The third natural element is fire, and this group is called Drakens. The fourth group, called Aquarians, represent the natural element of water. Your father is an Aquarian. Remember that summer when there was a really bad drought? Why do you think our property stayed so green? My mouth hung open at this point as my brain replayed the hazy fragments of my childhood. Lastly, the fifth group, which is the most special of them all, are called Orchins. They are special because they are so rare. They have the power of all the elements combined, which is why they are more powerful than anyone on Earth. Unfortunately, Orchins are extinct. The entire race was eradicated by other elementals centuries ago. They felt threatened by the Orchins' dominance and power. Wow, I commented dryly. That sucks. Genocide rarely works out. Can I ask a question now? All right. Okay, well, it might be a bit shocking, but I truly want to know. Are you ready to hear it? Go ahead. My mom smiled tightly. Are you crazy? I snapped, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Your father and I are very serious. Well, at least I still have the decency not to be. Alyssa, do light bulbs just explode by themselves? My dad interrupted. I refused to meet his gaze. Even if he was insane, he was right. Light bulbs don't just explode by themselves. Eric, my mother hissed, slamming a hand across the table. Not yet. Please, Sienna. She was raised as a mortal, so she thinks like a mortal. We're not getting anywhere like this. Hey, I'm right here. He held up a hand, cutting my next sentence off. That was you today, and we can prove it. Listen to us, my mother half shouted, her loud voice echoing throughout the room. Alyssa, you were born a Draken, an elemental of fire. Drakens are notorious for making things explode when angry. I take it you were pretty angry when it happened? I gulped. I was technically angry. But wasn't I always when Tori was involved? I snorted, trying not to hide my unease with a laugh. I'm a dragon? No, a Draken. So let me get this straight. I'm a Draken, Dad's an Aquarian, and you're a Terran? Yes, both parents have to be elemental to produce an elemental offspring. This is ridiculous! My voice was steadily rising. I know this seems ridiculous, my mom whispered, but it's the truth. The only truth here is that you're crazy. Sienna, we shouldn't have raised her as a mortal, my dad said. I told you. You know what could have happened if we didn't, my mother shot back. My jaw dropped at the unexpected outburst. My parents never fought. My mother glared at my father with an amount of venom I had never seen before. He scowled, rose from his seat, and wandered down the hallway into his office. He returned a moment later with a simple white slip of paper clutched in his hands. Now, what is that? I said, rolling my eyes. A spell. One of many from a textbook. Sure, it's a spell, just like you have a winning lottery ticket in your pocket, right? Think of spells like training wheels. Spells help channel one's power and help you guide what you want to do with your powers. When you're not using a spell, your magic is harder to control. For example, if you want to light that chair on fire, A spell could channel your power so that you don't set the whole house on fire. I blinked, digesting his words. Spells don't exist, I scoffed. It's all pop culture. My parents shared a knowing glance. Our magic is ancient, my dad explained, and elementals have coexisted with mortals since the dawn of time. A very long time ago, our culture was known and accepted by the rest of the world. Where do you think all the legends and stories come from?
So does that mean I would only be able to do Draken spells, like magic that deals with fire?
Exactly, my dad nodded. Spells start you off, make you familiar with your powers, and then once you master the spells, you train to do magic without them.
Right, I sneered.
Read it, my dad snapped. I quickly skimmed the paper. Whatever, it was just a bunch of random words written by two lunatics. My father grabbed a candle off the center of our table and nodded.
Would you like a lighter? I said mockingly.
Outside, my dad commanded, motioning with his hand. You're going to light this, he said firmly. Read the spell and it will light. Magic is in your blood. You're insane! I finally screamed, losing my carefully kept temper. My parents didn't even flinch, despite the intensity in my voice. Just read it! If nothing happens, then you can think we're crazy. I glared at them. It was a fair deal, and one that would end in my favor. I trembled as I got up from the table, storming outside into the backyard. My parents followed and stood side by side, blocking the door in case I tried to run. What was I, some sort of prisoner? Alyssa, you have nothing to fear, my dad said, trying to be comforting. The paper almost slipped out of my hands. Right, I had nothing to fear besides the crazy people who'd raised me all my life. My mother plucked the large candle out of my father's hand and placed it on the grass far away from the house. I swallowed as they both stepped backwards. What am I supposed to do? I asked quietly. Do you know how to read? My father asked coldly, clearly getting sick and tired of my attitude. Yes. Then read it. I stared stubbornly at them as they blocked the entrance to my house. My parents had completely lost their minds, and neither of them were going to let me leave until I obeyed. So I unfolded the paper from my sweaty palm, squinted, and began to read slowly. Send this wick ablaze. I shall not wither from this flame. Satisfy the needs of man, and simmer my dying rage. I finished reading with a sigh, crushing the paper in between my fingers. The anticipation hanging in the air was palpable, but the night wore on as usual. They had wasted almost an hour of my time, and suddenly I was so terribly angry that I could barely speak. That might have just been the stupidest thing I have ever done, I growled. Now you better let me through the door. An incredible piercing sensation erupted in my chest. Suddenly there was pain everywhere. It was a pulsing throb which in moments spread through my entire body. I keeled over, collapsing onto the grass, my face slamming into the mud. My body seemed to enter a state of paralysis for a moment, and the only coherent thought I had was that I could very well be dying. After a few excruciating moments, the pain slowly melted away, and when I could force enough air into my lungs, I got up off the ground. The world was a giant red blur as it slowly shifted back into focus. I screamed. The candle hadn't moved from its original spot on the grass, but it was most noticeably on fire. In fact, it was burning furiously, as was the patio and most of the backyard. The flames were huge, vicious talons that curled up towards the sky, sending smoke shooting past my head. It took a while to register that everything around me was ablaze, and even longer to question why I wasn't burning alive. Except that, in this moment, I had no fear. The flames were mesmerizing, singing a sort of hazy lullaby that was entrancing. My father was standing at the edge of the doorway, unmoving, And suddenly my mother was beside me with a fire extinguisher. She calmly pulled the pin and pressed down on the nozzle, projecting the frothy foam everywhere. I cowered behind the extinguisher, watching in shock as the substance tackled the flames into non-existence. Within minutes, any remnants of the raging fire was gone, but I was left with the haunting memory. That fire came from nowhere. Nowhere! Flames aren't supposed to ignite from uttering a ridiculous arrangement of words. I was so confused, but more than that, I was profoundly tired. An incredible weakness washed over me. My legs turned to jelly, and I crumpled to the ground with a painful thud. I laid on the grass, staring up at the starry sky, confused. Why was I floating? A sudden panicked voice yelled my name, but I couldn't turn around to see who it was. I was paralyzed in my body and mind, and if I could have felt anything, it would have been terror. Someone was violently shaking me, and I opened one of my eyes, relieved to find that I could still see. But my mother was hovering over me with an expression I didn't like, so I shut my eyes instead and slowly drifted off towards the impending darkness. When I finally awoke, I found myself neatly stretched out across the couch. I frowned, blinking up at the white ceiling. Oh, what happened? I heard my parents shuffling from across the room, and suddenly it all came flooding back. I bolted upright, my vision blurring, and rubbed my eyes groggily. I had so many questions, so many things that didn't make sense. If those memories were real, how could it possibly make sense? Mom? I whispered timidly. Eric, she's awake, my mom exclaimed softly, nudging my dad. Alyssa? He asked, his voice infuriatingly calm. How do you feel? Like I just blew up half our backyard. Honey, my mother said in a tone I no longer found soothing. What do you remember? Fire, I murmured, feeling a dangerous combination of fear and vulnerability, two things I vowed a long time ago I wouldn't let myself feel again. What happened? You passed out for over an hour. An hour? I exclaimed, bewildered. No, that's not possible. I glanced up at the clock, only to fall short in the middle of my sentence. A whole hour had actually passed. Well, thanks for not calling an ambulance or anything. The situation is quite difficult to explain, my dad answered, moving to sit next to me. What else do you remember? Everything, I snapped. I didn't hit my head, I just blew up the backyard. Saying it aloud almost made me cringe, but who was I to deny blatant proof that was right in front of my very eyes? Do you understand now? Do I want to? No, but I'm gonna have to, I answered truthfully, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I even realized I was going to say them, because this conversation is clearly far from over. I sighed and looked at my mom. Can I ask you a question? Go ahead, she answered, smiling. Are we human? Funny, in that moment it was the only thing I wanted to know. Well, first, elementals usually refer to humans as mortals, although I don't know how that started. It's not like we're immortal. Lord knows we die just like they do. However, even though we look like humans, we are not human. I nodded, squeezing my eyes shut. Did I even want to be a part of a race as cruel as that anyway? Yet there were so many good things about being human. Being able to love, the feeling of sadness, the feeling of anger. Sometimes human emotions were the only thing that made me feel alive. But as long as I could still feel, I would always be a person, right? It felt like my personal identity, or what little I had of one, was being shattered piece by piece as my parents answered more questions. I didn't even know if I would be able to rebuild. Was everything you said true? Yes. So I'm a Draken, one of the 5 elementals, I said, testing the foreign words. My parents exchanged an indecipherable look.
Yes, you are, my dad answered. But there's more.
How much more? I inquired, my stomach sinking. I didn't know how much more of this I could take.
A lot more,
he muttered.
Let me explain in further detail. Supernaturals is a broad term used to classify beings that include elementals and numerous other creatures.
Like what?
The list is endless. Witches, demons, spirits, stuff like that.
Wow, I commented dryly. It's like a giant Halloween party, isn't it?
My father glared. This isn't a joke.
Oh, I wasn't joking. This is a lot to process.
We're not done,
my mom interjected, rather unsympathetically. Alyssa, you must understand a few things from here on out. First, elementals have their own government system, and revealing our magic to mortals is a serious offense. He looked at me sharply. I had made the light bulb explode over Tori's head. Me. But it all happened so fast, and most importantly, she deserved it. Hey, you can't go blaming me for today, I warned. A little heads up would have been nice.
You need to take this seriously, my mom snapped. Our kind are always in danger. There are traitors and corruption everywhere. Be careful.
I can't be cautious of things I know nothing about, I said solemnly. Her expression clouded over as if recalling a slew of haunting memories. I could see her jaw working furiously to contain a temper I had never seen from her before. She took a shuddering breath.
There are evils in our world, evils that have yet to be brought down by the bravest and best of our elementals. We call that evil the Society. The Society is the most powerful elemental organization on the planet. They're a gang of murderers who are obsessed with eliminating all mortals and any supernaturals they see fit. You will need to be taught about these things and be extra cautious.
Well, what exactly can I do?